Hello, welcome to the Excel Olympics YouTube channel. My name is Gaspar Kamaszek. I'm an Excel MVP from Slovenia, the only country in the world that has the word love in the name. And in this video, I want to talk about the difference between a pivot table based on Excel data and a pivot table based on Power Pivot. Right? I'm going to emphasize three differences, but as we move along, I'm going to point out some other differences also. But these three should be enough to just make you want to jump into Power Pivot today and start using it. Because whereas Power Pivot was actually built so you can work in Excel with big data sets, you can also just push 12 rows into Power Pivot because it gives you the benefits. The benefits I'm going to show you now. Let me just start with a quick little theory behind it. So what is Power Pivot? Power Pivot was an add-in introduced in 2009. So it was first introduced in Excel 2010. And in 2013, it was no longer an add-in. It was part of Excel. Now, we still had to check it as an add-in, but it was part of Excel. It was built in. You didn't have to install it separately. And what it basically is, you can forget this immediately, but it's SQL Server Analysis Services Tabular brought into Excel. And what you're building essentially is an OLAP cube, right? You're building an OLAP cube that you can then utilize through pivot tables in Excel, okay? Because there's a lot of kind of misunderstanding here where people think that Power Pivot is a pivot table on steroids. Well, it's not. Power Pivot is a whole other beast behind a pivot table that you can build on that, and it does give you certain benefits. And we're going to look at three of those in this session. So the data we have is 1,007,006 rows of data. Now there are two files. One is here that data is loaded into Excel, and then there's another file where that data is loaded. Where is it loaded to? Well, the Excel is empty, so it's loaded into Power Pivot. And let me just show you the first thing that you're going to notice. Let me just delete that measure over there. So the first thing you're going to notice when you're talking about, okay, so Power Pivot or Excel Pivot, what's the difference? Well, here's the difference. This has data loaded into Excel, and it's 74 megs. That's a lot. That's a big file. Whereas this one, it's Power Pivot based. It's only 7 megs, right? Big difference. Same amount of data loaded. Now, that's because Power Pivot uses X-Velocity engine. You can forget that immediately, but that's what it does. So that every column, it doesn't even matter how many rows there are. It matters how many unique values are in that column, and then they get indexed. So basically, it stores the data much more efficiently, and you can use it much more efficiently. So that's why the size is that much smaller. Okay? So that's the first difference you should have in mind between pushing data into Excel or working with Excel, or when to use Power Pivot. Now let's go to Excel and let's just emphasize those three things, right? I said we're going to do three things as the major differences. There are a lot more, but these three we're going to emphasize. So the first thing I'm going to add here are two columns, basically a year column and a month column. And you're going to notice the difference when I start writing here, because it's a big table, right? We're not really used to a table behaving as this one will. So if I press enter now, this is going to take a while. And if I go equals text from, again, the same date, formatted as two M&Ms, and then let's just go back so we'll see how long it takes to build this. There it is. And now let's build a pivot table from this. So let's go insert pivot table. Just put it into the new sheet. And what we're going to do is we're going to build a very simple pivot table, but one that will leave us sort of wanting three things. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add the month here. I'm going to use the slicer for the year. Let's say 2012. Now this should probably be better like this, but it doesn't really matter. And then I'm going to add the income as the calculation. And as I do that, I'm going to format it as currency without any decimals. And then I'm going to add the destination and the carrier. Okay. Now, 3 things I would want. Number 1, I would want to have the sum up here, but in the grand total, I would want a different calculation. What I'm pointing at here, sometimes you have things that are not additive. Like percentages are a good reference of that. So sometimes you have things that these can be sums, but in the end you want the average of those or a different calculation. Now in regular pivot tables, whatever the calculation is, that's what's going to happen here. You can affect it slightly with show values as, but just slightly. You can't do what I just said. And then the second thing we want to do is we want to exclude EasyJet from Amsterdam, but we still want to see EasyJet over here at Brussels. Now I know we could hide this column, but that's not what I'm going for. What I'm going for is if I do a filter and just uncheck EasyJet, well, it's going to disappear from the entire pivot table, right? So that's not a solution. And the third thing I want to do, right in between these two, I want to add an extra column just to do my calculation. I want to do a special calculation over there. Can I do that? Well, no. A pivot table is a unity and you can't separate it. You can't just, put columns in there. Okay, so these are the things I want and I can't quite get from a regular pivot table. And now let's go to the other pivot table. So let's go to the Power Pivot table. So what I'm going to do, Power Pivot based pivot table, I should say. So I'm going to create a pivot table from the data model. I'm going to put it right there. And the first thing I notice is, oh, I should have added the year and the month as I did there. So I'm just going to go into Power Pivot. And what I'm going to do may surprise you, but I'm not going to add them here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to say, well, I need a date table. Create me a new one. And what that will do is it will calculate a calendar table for me. With all the columns that I need, I could add extra. I could add a lot of extra columns now. You can watch the calendar table series that I did a while back to see what all I could add. But over here, I'm quite happy with the year and the month. And these will obviously be in Slovenian, so there's that. And now if I go back over here, I have that calendar table, but there's a problem. Do you see this line? A line is saying, look, you have those two tables, but they're not connected in any way. And the best way to show you this was if I would have added the month at this point from the calendar table and then brought in a calculation, any calculation from the from this table, it would just look ridiculous. It will look like this. It's as if those two don't even see each other, right? So let me put both of those out. I don't need to, but let me do that. And let's create a connection here that we need. So let's say, okay, these are the two tables. This is a date and this is a date. And now that those two can talk to each other, let's go back to Excel. And now let's say, do you see how that line disappeared? And now let's say, okay, so the first thing I want is the month column, like this. And the second thing I want is my calculation, but I'm not going to add the income column. Because in Power Pivot, you have something called measures. They're DAX calculations. And those are the ones that will enable us to have a different calculation at the grand total level and different calculation within the pivot table. But those are called measures. And if I added income here, I would get an implicit measure, which I can't build upon, so that's not an option. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go measures, new measure. So I'm just going to build one. And I'm going to call this, let's call this income base. And it will be as simple as it gets. So it's just a sum of, and it will be a sum of income. This column, like this. So I check it, say this currency, like that, and okay. Right? Nothing fancy there. So if I now add the year as a slicer as I did there, pick this one and let's just do it exactly the same way. So like this. There it is. Okay, now these are the numbers, the same numbers as we saw over there, right? But now I want to go a step further. Now I want to say, yeah, that's cool, but let's create a new calculation. And I'll go Power Pivot, Measures, New Measure. I'll call this one True Income. This is not the way you calculate income, but I hope it will resonate. So I'll start off with an if, and then a has one value. And the column I'm trying to look at is month. Now, why am I doing this? Well, because over here, month has a single value. It's February. But down here, month has all of these values, right? So if it has a single value, I actually know that at this point, I'm calculating up here. So if I'm doing that, just calculate my income base. But if not, if I'm down here, what I'm actually going to do is recreate the table up there. So I'm going to say, give me all the month names, calculate the sums, and then calculate the average of those. And that will be my average X function. A very important function. Well, every X function is very important in DAX. And I'm going to go through the calendar month column, but not just like that. I'm going to put a function called values, and what that one will do is it will build a single column of all the values in that column, so all the months. And then what I want to calculate for each of those is my base income. And then once those are calculated, the average will sit through them and just give me the result. Again, it's a currency, no decimal places, and okay. And it says that, oh, yeah, well, obviously this one needs an extra for the if function. Okay, so now do you see? These are all incomes, but this one is an average of those, right? So problem one solved. Now I'm going to put the income base out, so I'm just going to go with this one. And then I'm going to add the destination and the carrier, remember, just as we did over there. And what was our initial goal? Well, we wanted EasyJet here, but we didn't want it there. Or maybe it was the other way around, but you know what we mean. And if you have a pivot table based on Power Pivot, what you can do is you can build a so-called set, right? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a set based on column items. And here you can just simply say, yeah, so this item, Amsterdam EasyJet, I don't want that one. And then for Belgrade, I don't want Adria, delete. But you see, I still have Adria for Amsterdam and Brussels. And I'm just going to end here, but you could go through the entire data set, including the calculations that are totals, right? So over here we have all, that's the grand total, and you can add calculations, but I'm just going to leave it at this. I'm going to call it my set, and what happens is when I say okay, this my set is going to get added over here, and it's now part of the model. So in any pivot table I would create, I would get that set, and I could just add it with a single click. And can you see? There's no, what was it? There's no EasyJet over here anymore, right? But I didn't hide any columns. It's just, it's not there, right? A great, great thing. Okay, and the next thing, remember when we wanted to just, over here, I would want to have a different, what was it? I think it was a slicer. right? Well, how would you do that? No, it wasn't a slicer. Sorry, we wanted a calculated column. So a custom column with our own calculation. Now, in a pivot table, you can do that. Over here, I still can do that. But because this is a Power Pivot based pivot table, it's actually an OLAP cube behind the scenes. So what I have available for me now are OLAP tools. And one of those is, oh, I can convert this to a formula. And if I do that, the whole pivot table will get converted to a bunch of formulas. But watch this. It still knows what my slicer says. So it kind of behaves still as a pivot table. But now I can say, well, between this and this, let's just insert a column and let's go equals this plus this. That's the one I want, right? Like that. And that's my custom column. Pure brilliance, right? Okay, now these are just 3 of the things that you can do if you have a Power Pivot based pivot table in Excel. But there are a lot more things that you can do. And remember, it's not only because here the data was big and it was derived from Power Query, but even if I just had this and I wanted to analyze it somehow, and let me just sort of make that better, and I wanted to analyze this somehow, and this was a table, I could just go, well, look, insert a pivot table from this by adding this to the data model. And just by doing that, I'm not even seeing the whole Power Pivot thing, but this table, if I now say, give me column 1 and give me column 2, right? This is a Power Pivot pivot table. So I can now turn it into formulas and do everything that a Power Pivot table can. Okay. So these were 3 major differences. Now, a while back, and this is really a while back, I was sort of surprised when I saw this. So I wrote the part 1 in March of 2014. But over here, you really have 10 differences. It goes through the series. So I'm going to leave the links to this below. And if you really want to see all the differences for this, read through this. And really, I think you're going to learn a lot about Power Pivot and maybe even start using Power Pivot differently or using it at all, right? So maybe you're going to start using it. And just as a reference, let me go back to this. And since I didn't save anything, it's not really going to show me anything. I'm just going to save this file, but more importantly, I'm going to save this file. So in Excel, I added the 2 columns and I created a pivot table, that's it. Whereas in the Power Pivot based one, I added a whole table. I actually added 2 tables into the Power Pivot model. I added a pivot table, and then I added the extra table in Excel that was just really nothing, just a small range of data. And now let's look at how much space these use. And you can see that the Power Pivot based one didn't really change that much, whereas the Excel based one is now 160 megs. That's more than 40 megabytes more than we started with, right? And even if it was usable before, it's kind of unusable now as something that you have to wait upon. Okay, I hope you sort of got the sense of why Power Pivot is called Power Pivot, right? And why pivot tables based on Power Pivot data model are superior to the regular pivot tables in Excel. And with that said, thank you for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.